Part 1. A New Beginning. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I had just moved into the house on Maple Street, a quiet little neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The house was affordable, an old 2-story with a cracked sidewalk leading up to the porch. I'd been looking for a place for a while, and this one checked all the boxes. Decent size, good location, and at a price that seemed too good to pass up. The kind of place you think you could finally settle into. The first day was normal, like any other. The sun shone through the windows, casting warm golden light onto the dusty floors. I went room to room, unpacking boxes and picturing how I'd make the space my own. It was the usual routine, nothing to worry about. But the first night, after all the boxes had been put away, something felt off. I had just finished dinner and was sitting in the living room, watching TV. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made the air feel thick, like the space was holding its breath. I looked around the room, the flickering light from the TV casting strange shadows across the walls. I tried to shake the feeling, but I couldn't. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the direction of the stairs. I froze. My first instinct was to dismiss it as the house settling. Old houses creak, right? But the sound wasn't just a creak. It was a tap, 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 tap. Soft, rhythmic, like someone was walking across the floor upstairs. I stood up, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd left something on the second floor that was causing the sound, but as I walked toward the stairs, the sound stopped. It was unnervingly silent now. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was an old house. Old houses make noises. I shook my head and went back to the couch, but I couldn't stop looking up at the stairs. I felt a strange unease settle over me, like I wasn't alone. That night I lay in bed, wide awake. Every little noise, the house settling, the wind outside, seemed amplified. I tried to convince myself it was just first night nerves, but deep down I knew that something was wrong. Part 2. The Dark Presence. The following days didn't help. I kept hearing the tapping sound, but it wasn't just limited to the stairs. It started happening at random times throughout the house. Sometimes it was faint, like the sound of someone pacing back and forth. Other times it would come from the kitchen, like someone was moving dishes. I even heard it once while I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the empty room, when I thought I saw the shadow of something moving past the doorway. At first I convinced myself it was my imagination, but after the third day I started paying closer attention. The sounds were real, and they weren't coming from the house settling. One evening, while I was taking a shower, the door to the bathroom creaked open. I didn't think much of it at first, thinking maybe it was just the humidity causing the door to shift. But when I stepped out of the shower and reached for the towel, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The mirror. The reflection was different. For a brief moment, I thought I was seeing things, but there, in the mirror, was a figure standing just outside the bathroom door. It was too quick for me to focus on, but I saw it clearly enough. A tall, shadowy figure, standing motionless, watching me. I turned around instantly, but there was no one there. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. The mirror was reflecting nothing but the bathroom, the empty space behind me. I rushed out of the bathroom, my legs shaking as I turned on every light in the house. I checked every corner, every room, but there was no one. Nothing. The house was empty except for me. The silence that followed was suffocating. I didn't know what to make of it, but the unease only grew stronger. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was in the house, something I couldn't explain. Part 3. The Final Night. I couldn't sleep that night. I couldn't even stay in the house alone. I decided to go stay at a friend's place, but as I grabbed my jacket and walked toward the front door, the temperature dropped suddenly. The air in the room felt heavier, thick, like the weight of the house itself was pressing down on me. I walked to the door and turned the knob, but it wouldn't budge. I twisted harder, but the door was stuck. Panicked, I slammed into it, but it didn't move. The air seemed to grow colder, and I could feel a strange energy swirling around me, pressing in from all sides. Tap, tap, tap. The sound. It was back, and this time it was coming from above, right above me. Slowly, deliberately, the taps echoed through the walls. I could feel it in my bones, like the house itself was alive, watching me. I turned toward the stairs, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing halfway up the stairs, just out of the reach of the light. The shadow was tall, thin, and completely still. I could barely make out its features, but the shape was unmistakable. The figure's head turned slowly, almost unnaturally, until its eyes met mine. Its face was featureless, just a blank void that seemed to swallow the light. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The figure started moving toward me, its steps slow and deliberate. Every step it took sent a chill through me. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. I stumbled backward, reaching for the door, but it was still stuck. My fingers fumbled with the handle, but then, just as the figure reached the bottom of the stairs, the door swung open. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran out of the house, heart pounding in my ears, and didn't look back. I haven't returned to that house since. I don't know what I saw or what was living there with me, but I know one thing for sure, it didn't want me there. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the tapping, still feel its eyes on me. Part 1. A routine relocation. I had always prided myself on being a rational person. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. So when I moved into my new apartment located on the 3rd floor of an old, somewhat run-down building, I didn't think much of it. The rent was cheap, the apartment had everything I needed, and the location was perfect. The only drawback was that it felt a bit empty. It was a weekday when I finally moved in. Just a few boxes to unpack, a couple of quick trips to get the furniture set up, nothing that should have raised an eyebrow. The apartment itself was quiet, but not in an unsettling way. It was simply one of those places that had a history, the kind you could feel when you entered, but couldn't quite name. The first few nights were uneventful, just the usual settling sounds an apartment makes, the creaks of the floorboards, the sounds of traffic below. But on the 4th night, things took a turn. I had just finished my dinner and was sitting by the window, my thoughts wandering, staring out at the city below. The streetlights flickered dimly in the distance, and the occasional sound of a car passing by filled the air. As I sat there, something caught my eye. It was the window across from mine, the building directly across the alley. The light in the apartment across the way was on. I had noticed it before, but tonight it felt different. I saw movement. A figure just barely visible in the reflection of the window. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. Perhaps the person living there, moving about, unaware that I was watching. But something about it felt off. The figure paused by the window, standing motionless for a few moments before it moved. But the movement was wrong. The person, whoever they were, was standing too still for too long. I couldn't see much detail, but I could tell they were staring back at me. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe they were just another neighbor. But the longer I stared at the figure, the more aware I became of the fact that it wasn't just a casual glance. This person, whoever they were, was standing in front of the window, motionless, watching me. Part 2. The Unseen Observer. It could have been coincidence, I thought. I mean, we all glance at our neighbors, right? But the next night, the same thing happened. Again, I was sitting at the window, just thinking. The apartment was quiet, and as I casually looked across the alley, there it was, the light on in the same apartment and the same figure in the window. This time, I didn't wait. I stood up and walked closer, trying to make out any details through the glass. My heart rate quickened as I tried to focus, but it was almost impossible to make out anything concrete. The figure was still there, just beyond the edge of my sight. I couldn't tell if they were just standing there or if something more sinister was at play. The figure wasn't moving, not even a twitch. But as I stared at it longer, something changed. The figure's shape seemed to blur in the window, like it was stretching or warping, becoming distorted. It felt like the very air between us was thickening. I turned away, my stomach in knots, trying to rationalize it. It's just a neighbor, I kept telling myself. Maybe they're standing too close to the window. Maybe I'm just seeing things. But by the time I sat down on the couch, the feeling of being watched had settled deep in my bones. I couldn't shake it. I glanced over at the window, half expecting to see the figure still there. But there was nothing. The window across the alley was dark. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the figure watching me, unmoving, waiting. The next day, I convinced myself I had been overreacting. It had been a strange coincidence, nothing more. But as the days passed, the feeling of being watched never left. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense it became. Part 3. The silent reflection. It wasn't long before the figure started to appear more frequently. Each night, without fail, the light in that apartment across from mine would flick on, and I'd see the shape standing in the window. But this time, it was different. The figure wasn't standing still. It was pacing. I knew what I was seeing. I wasn't imagining it anymore. I could see the subtle movements now. The figure walking back and forth in front of the window, casting long, dark shadows against the thin curtains. It was impossible to make out details from my apartment, but the pacing was unmistakable. The movements were unnervingly slow, almost deliberate. And then, one night, the figure stopped. It didn't just stop walking. It froze right in the middle of the window, staring, watching. The air in my apartment felt thick, too thick. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, the hairs on my arms standing at attention. I couldn't look away. Every instinct screamed for me to look away, to move, to do anything but keep staring. But I was paralyzed, my eyes locked onto the figure in the window across from me. It was at that moment that I realized the figure wasn't in the window anymore. It was in the reflection, a shadow standing just behind me. I whipped around, my breath caught in my throat, but of course there was nothing there. The reflection was empty. My mind raced as I checked every corner of the room, but the feeling of eyes on me wouldn't go away. I wanted to leave, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Then the tapping started. Tap, tap, tap. From behind me, right on the window. I turned back, heart pounding, and saw nothing but the reflection of my own terrified face in the darkened glass. But the taps continued. Tap, tap, tap. I rushed to the window and yanked it open, expecting to find a neighbor, or maybe someone playing a prank, but there was no one. The alley was empty. I pulled the window shut and stumbled back into the apartment, my body shaking with the kind of cold I couldn't shake. That night, I didn't sleep. Not a single minute. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear those taps echoing through my mind. I moved out a week later. I couldn't stay. The landlord didn't care when I told him about the strange happenings, and I didn't have the energy to fight it. I left everything behind, the apartment, the window, the strange figure, and moved far away. But I still hear those taps in the dead of night. They never stopped. And sometimes, when I look into the reflection in my new apartment's windows, I feel the same chill, the same sensation of being watched, waiting. Part 1. The Unseen Door. It was a small, nondescript house on the edge of town, the kind that no one really notices. I had just moved in, looking for a fresh start after a turbulent few years. The house was a bit older, with creaky floors and windows that let in a bit too much draft, but it felt right. For once, I felt like I was in a place where I could breathe. The first few days went by uneventfully. I unpacked, settled in, and began making the place feel like home. There was something comforting about its solitude. I had a routine: wake up, go to work, come home, make dinner, and wind down with a book or some TV. Simple. Peaceful. But one evening, as I was cleaning up at the kitchen, I noticed something strange. The door to the basement, which I had been careful to leave shut, was now slightly ajar. I hadn't gone near it, let alone opened it. My first thought was that it must have been the wind, or maybe I had accidentally left it open. But something about it felt off. I walked over, hesitated, and then gently pushed the door open. The stairs led down into a dark, musty basement. Nothing out of the ordinary at first glance, but then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The far corner of the basement, right where the shadows were the thickest, seemed different. It was as though the darkness there was more profound, like it was swallowing the light from the room above. I quickly stepped back, my pulse racing, and shut the door. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, an old house settling, but a nagging feeling lingered in my chest. Something was there, and I had to know what it was. Part 2. The Secret Space. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had shifted. It was like the air had thickened, and no matter where I went in the house, there was a sense of unease. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was always there, just beneath the surface, making me check over my shoulder more than I should. I tried to go on with my routine, but the door to the basement wouldn't leave my mind. I couldn't just ignore it. There had to be something down there, something hidden. I didn't want to be the kind of person who let fear control them, so I decided to explore the basement properly. When I opened the basement door again, I felt the coldness hit me before I even stepped down the stairs. It wasn't the kind of cold from the winter air. It was a deep, unnatural cold, the kind that makes your breath freeze in the air. I hesitated for a moment, but forced myself to step down, one slow step after another, the stairs creaking under my weight. The basement was larger than I had expected, but it was almost entirely empty. A few boxes, an old furnace in the corner, and piles of forgotten junk covered in sheets. Nothing that would explain the strange feeling I had. But as I reached the back of the basement, where the shadows were deepest, I noticed something odd. There was a wall, a brick wall. At first glance, it didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been a wall there. The basement was supposed to stretch the entire length of the house. But this wall was different. The bricks were slightly uneven, and the mortar between them looked fresh. My curiosity got the better of me. I reached out and ran my fingers along the surface of the wall, feeling the coolness of the bricks beneath my fingertips. Then I noticed something that made my breath catch, a small, hidden latch, barely noticeable, hidden between the bricks. It was rusted, old and unused, but it was there, unmistakable. I pulled the latch and the wall creaked open, revealing a small, narrow passage. My pulse quickened as I stared into the dark void. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. The air grew colder as I stepped into the passage. The walls were covered in old wallpaper, yellowed and torn in places, and the narrow space led deeper into the house. It felt like I had uncovered something that should have stayed hidden. I couldn't help myself. I had to see where it led. Part 3, the room. The passageway seemed to stretch on forever, but after what felt like an eternity of crawling and stumbling over uneven ground, I finally reached a door at the end. It was a small door, barely bigger than a closet door, but it was covered in the same old wallpaper as the passage. I didn't want to open it. I should have turned around, but the same overwhelming curiosity that had driven me to this point pushed me forward. I reached for the doorknob and slowly turned it, the rusty hinges squeaking in protest. The door opened into a small room, barely more than a closet, but it was definitely a room. The walls were bare, save for a single, small window at the far side. The furniture inside was sparse, a single wooden chair, a small table, and an old faded rug on the floor. But it wasn't the room itself that struck me. It was the feeling of it, the heaviness in the air, the sense of being watched. I stepped inside, my heart racing in my chest. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it, an intense pressure, like the room itself was holding me in place. My body was frozen, my mind screaming at me to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room on the floor was someone, sitting in the chair. It wasn't a person, at least not fully. The figure was hunched, its head bowed low, long, stringy hair obscuring its face. It was completely still, too still. I couldn't even hear it breathe. I could feel its presence, though. It was palpable, a cold weight that settled deep in my chest. I tried to move, to step back, but my feet wouldn't obey. I was trapped, unable to take my eyes off the figure. And then, as if it had been waiting for me all this time, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately. Its head lifted, and I saw its face. Or what was left of it, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared right through me. The air thickened as it whispered a single word, leave. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And before I knew it, the door slammed shut behind me. I don't know how I managed to get out of the passageway. All I remember is running, stumbling through the dark, my heart hammering in my chest, until I was back in my apartment, gasping for air. I never went back down there. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind, including the forgotten room. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still hear the whisper, the feeling of being watched. And I know whatever was in that room, it's still there. Sometimes the things we find when we dig too deep are better left untouched. The forgotten rooms, the dark corners, the things we can't explain, They stay with us, lingering just out of sight, and they don't forget us. The house that holds its secrets. The figure that waits in the shadows. The room that should have stayed locked. They're always there, always waiting for the next person to cross their path. You can run, you can leave, but the feeling remains. And maybe, just maybe, they're still watching, still waiting for you to come back. So the next time you think about looking under the surface, about uncovering the hidden things, think carefully, because some doors are meant to stay closed. End of script. Sleep well.